We learn from the devastation we have witnessed. I'm joined tonight by Catherine Hayhoe, who's a director at the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, and Paul Kovacs, executive director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, and he is in Toronto tonight. And Paul, let me begin with you. Is Irma a climate change story?
Our climate is changing. It is having complicated impacts on hurricanes, so it is unclear whether Irma is a climate change story. But one of the things that we need to learn is that in a changing climate, there will be more large storms. Climate change will bring more large storms. We need to start getting ready now.
So unclear as to whether it was caused by climate change, but where do you fall on this, Catherine? Because, for example, we heard from the mayor of Miami saying that this is, if not climate change, he doesn't know what it is, that it's a poster child for what is to come. Is there a link?
The science is very clear that a changing climate does not cause hurricanes, but it exacerbates them. It takes the hurricanes that are already happening and it amps them up with higher sea level, stronger storm surges, more rainfall on average associated with a given hurricane, and, as Paul just mentioned, a greater risk that we're going to be seeing stronger hurricanes in the future. Not any more frequent ones, but the ones that come along are likely to be stronger on average.
So to that end, Paul, I mean, you are actually sending, your institute has a research team down there in Florida going to be studying Irma. What is it in particular about this hurricane that is interesting to you?
25 years ago, Hurricane Andrew struck, and that was a game changer. And Florida upped its building codes. It has changed its practices over the last 25 years in a number of ways. We have a team on site. We're trying to find out if the newer buildings are really holding up better, as we expect they will. And we're expecting there'll be enormous damage to some of the older buildings that have not been retrofit, that have not been dealt with. So we're trying to get out in the field and see what the actual damage is. We don't get winds like this very often. This is a remarkable, large storm. When they occur, it's important that we learn from them.
Catherine, I mean, listening to that, in terms of changes after Andrew, there were changes and improvements made in the state of Florida, but it's interesting. Question of maybe what more could have been done, should have been done. And your work, you actually deal with cities. You talk about being proactive in your infrastructure and your planning. What's your sense there about how willing cities are in terms of trying to prevent things of this nature?
It completely depends on the city. The reality is that the risk we face from incredibly strong hurricanes, damaging floods like Houston experienced just recently, as well as to other types of weather extremes, are the sum of three different factors. Number one is how many people and how much valuable infrastructure is exposed. Number two is how vulnerable is this infrastructure and are the people. And number three, of course, is the hazard. How strong is the hazard and is it being amplified by a changing climate? When I work with cities, there's not too much that we personally can do about the hazard, but we can definitely work on reducing the vulnerability in the ways that Paul described, as well as, for example, in Houston, by looking at where water goes when it falls and making sure it goes where people want it to go rather than where we don't, as we saw, unfortunately, just the other week.
But you were in Houston earlier this year to talk about that specific point, to talk about being less vulnerable to flooding. And what kind of response did you get from city officials, or did your warnings fall on deaf ears?
Unfortunately, Houston is not a city that is known for thinking long-term in terms of building resilience to the increasingly frequent extreme floods that they're already seeing today. Other cities, though, are taking these changing extremes seriously. Chicago, Washington, D.C., Austin, Texas. I'm working with all of those cities to determine what types of risks we currently face today and have faced already in the past, and how we can build our resilience and prepare for those risks when they come back in the future.
I think it's interesting, Paul. I mean, we have seen public officials from the state governor to the mayors of the various Miami cities. They're holding news conferences every few minutes. They're trying to be seen as being capable crisis managers. But what have they done beforehand in all of this? I mean, is there a political will, as you see it, to act in a proactive manner?
There's two parts to some of the metrics we use to find out whether the performance has been strong or weak. One looks at loss of life, and the other looks at property damage. Loss of life in the United States, the efforts to talk to 6 million people and tell them to evacuate, the messaging that was used was remarkably proactive to tell people this is not just another day, just another storm. And the efforts in the United States to protect against loss of life is really quite strident, quite effective. And we'll see, we didn't protect everybody from this storm, but I think despite the size of the storm, the amount of loss of life is going to be quite low. The weakness is protecting property. As Catherine mentioned, some cities take this more seriously, some states take this more seriously. The state of Florida did really react after Andrew 25 years ago and did a number of very positive things. There are other states that still don't even have building codes. So there's a range of different actions across Canada, across the United States. Florida has done some positive things, but needs to do more to protect property from the risks that take place.
And what do you think is going to change then, Paul, as a result of Irma?
Irma is an absolutely remarkable storm. I hope it is a game changer for those who have been unwilling to push harder in terms of what's going on. The biggest failing in the United States has been allowing development to take place, allowing houses to be built in areas that are really high risk. And we're now fairly late in the game because we now have millions of people living in very, very high risk areas, coastal areas that should be a beach rather than a series of buildings and constructions. I would love to see more of it. It's now very late to try to get people out of harm's way. That's where the greatest opportunity lies, but the greatest challenge lies as well.
You know, it's interesting to your point. One of the best quotes I read in the Washington Post today, Florida is like a heroin addict when it comes to development. On that very point, maybe people in areas where they just simply shouldn't be. At what point, Catherine, do we start having the discussion about whether people should be in these areas, whether or not it's time to abandon some of these areas? Who pays for that? And people are going to start being resentful of constantly funneling money into rebuild and cover insurance and cover subsidies and all of these things. Where are we in that conversation?
This is a thorny issue that I was actually just discussing with representatives from the reinsurance industry this week. In Miami, some cities are being very proactive. Miami Beach is raising the level of many of its key streets by several feet, as well as installing pumps, whereas, of course, other areas are not. The reality is that cities can't move. People can move, investments can move, but cities can't move. And we have 2/3 of the world's largest cities all around the world lying within a meter or so of sea level. And sea level is rising, which exacerbates the risks of coastal flooding associated with any hurricane or coastal storm in the future. We're increasing our vulnerability and our exposure as the hazard is increasing as well, and that equals more risk.
And Paul, last thought on this to you?
I was in Sendai when the United Nations pulled together the latest strategy on handling disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes and other hazards. This is the toughest issue, I think, that comes up again and again. People want to live in areas that seem attractive on a good day, but on a bad day, this is not the right place to be. And how to get people to understand where you choose to locate is incredibly important. We're making progress on building codes, we're making progress on warnings, the media are getting the message out about how to be safe during the storm. But how do you stop people from going to dangerous areas is a very, very difficult global discussion.
Questions to come in the days ahead. Paul Kovacs, Catherine Hayhoe, I thank you very much both for your time tonight.